Today we're going to look at an absolute legacy of the trucking industry and the truck manufacturing sector, Pacific Trucks, built right here in British Columbia. The way I figure, if we're going to build the best trucks ourselves, we got to look at the history of some of the best trucks ever built, and Pacific is absolutely up there in the top tier. Pacific Trucks was started in 1947 in Vancouver, BC by three ex-Hayes employees: Vic Barclay, Mac Billingsley, and Claude Thick. Believe it or not, Pacific built their first truck on a wharf, just literally a dock in Vancouver. The way we started in a tent shop, these guys started in the 40s working outside on a deck to build their first one. First truck that rolled out of the shop was a Model EMAD in May 1947. This truck was sold to Botswater Pulp and Paper in Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada, 3,000 miles away from the factory. Believe it or not, Pacific, when they built their first truck, decided to send that truck 3,000 miles away to the other side of the country. Talk about nervousness. We're nervous to sell one of our trucks to a company in Alberta because we're like, well, if we got to maintain it, it's in Alberta. These guys built the truck and said, no, screw it. I will send it to the other side of the world. It'll be fine. Pacific quickly established themselves as one of the better truck builders of the time. Their quality and reputation immediately was very, very visible. And soon, within just 1 year, they had already received orders from major forestry companies and independent logging companies to provide trucks and trailers, including logging trucks and low beds, to those suppliers. Within just 1 year, they went from moving off a dock into an actual production facility. By the late 1940s, after a few years in production, their name and their quality really expanded them past the logging industry. They got into building fire trucks, they got into cement trucks. They really expanded very quickly to within 2-3 years needing to upgrade their shop again to meet their manufacturing demand. In 1953, Pacific had a manufacturing capability of 1 truck every 2 months. That's about the speed that they could build them back then, is that, yeah, you order a truck, within 2 months, we can actually build that truck. Needless to say, their reputation and quality mandated that they expand again. And by 1954, they had reached the New Zealand market. Once they heard about the quality of these trucks on the west coast of Canada working in extremely remote logging camps, New Zealand decided that, hey, we can take a chance on that. New Zealand was a remote island, which necessitated that they didn't have an available part supply like a lot of regions in North America. For that reason, New Zealand and the west coast of British Columbia, Canada was very same. These were remote logging camps that needed to work off their own supply. They needed the most reliable trucks. So when New Zealand came over to Canada and seen that these loggers out here were using Pacifics, they decided to have their own Pacifics. 1954, they placed an order for 6 trucks sent directly to New Zealand. And since then, Pacific Truck had become a large truck supplier to the New Zealand market. Between 1955 and 1956, changes were slow, and mainly the styling was changed due to the style of headlights, fenders, and they stayed with this first style of truck they built up until 1956. These trucks had square fenders, large single headlights mounted on the front bumper, and they had a round grille in place of the radiator. When they changed the design up, the mounted headlights were moved to the side of the radiator instead of the front bumper. These trucks came with a guard over the top of the lights and a grille guard in front of an exposed radiator with shutters. The name Pacific was painted on the hood, and Pacific was cast into the upper rad tank. By the late 1950s, early 60s, they had manufactured a cab over, of which they built 4 cab overs, and then realized that no, cab overs weren't their thing. But Pacific did build 4 cab overs in the 1960s. By the mid-1960s, we had seen a lot of other design changes to the truck. The E model was replaced by the P model that you see here. This one is a 1971 Pacific P9. The cutout Pacific that you see here on the older trucks was now replaced by this logo. They had come out and moved away from the rounded, flat, separated fenders to these flat fenders where you see the 4 headlights, instead of having the headlight mounted off the side of the radiator. In 1963, Pacific unveiled their first I-beam truck. Instead of a standard C-channel frame, what Pacific did is they used a 16-inch solid I-beam for their frame rails. That's what's known as the Pacific P16 in 1964. This was state of the art for the time. By the late 1960s, logging, and especially off-highway logging, was at its height in the coast of BC. The demand was so high that Pacific had to move again. They bought a 5-acre facility up in North Vancouver with a 42,000 square foot shop to start producing trucks at an even higher volume. In 1970, Pacific was building at 25 trucks per month, when unfortunately in August of 1970, they were bought out by International Harvester, 100% outright. International provided a lot of the money to further expand their facilities again in very short time, and they stepped up their production, where in 1971 they had rolled their 500th truck off the line, which is currently this truck right here that we have. If you have a look at this serial number plate here, remember this is the 1970s before the standardized VIN numbers, the long 14, 16 digit numbers you see now. Right here, this would tell you about all the information you need to know about the truck. For example, if you start with that T, that tells you truck because Pacific also made trailers. 71 tells you that it was built in 1971. 55 means that it's 55,000 pound rear ends. And 500 tells us that this was the 500th truck that Pacific ever made. And of course the model is a P9. The 9 stands for 9-inch frame rails. This truck has a 9-inch frame rail. P10, 10-inch frame rail. P12, 12-inch. P16, 16-inch frame rail, I-beam. At this time, Pacific was still a very small manufacturer at 25-30 units per month. This ability to be small was actually their comparative advantage in the market. Because they were small but specialized, they could build custom trucks. The mottos of Pacific was always that every truck you built was custom. This custom design is what led to a lot of their success through the 70s in with International. I think it's actually one of the reasons International probably acquired them. While International was building mass highway trucks, they acquired Pacific to serve that niche market. One of the pride examples of this is back in the early 70s, I think it was 1972, 1973, South Africa, a power company, asked Pacific to build units to move 370-ton loads across Africa, where temperatures would be 40, 50 degrees above Celsius. I don't know what that is in American, 110, 120 degrees. But you try and take a truck from 1973 to move 370 tons across Africa on a regular basis. Pacific said that they would do it on the condition that they fly their general production manager down there, their main engineer down there. He met with them and they came up with a model which they called the P12, 12-inch frame rail. And that truck was over 13 feet tall to the top of the cab. It had a V12 Cummins with 800 horsepower back in the 1973s. They built a bunch of these trucks specifically for export to South Africa. I think they built 10, 12 of these by the time they were done. So they service New Zealand, logging industries really around the world with global specialized trucks and special heavy haul. That's where you start seeing in the 1970s the roughneck winch tractors, the bed trucks that would go to Alberta. They really expanded on that custom truck. In the mid-1970s, Pacific also had a successful trailer manufacturing. So basically you could buy the truck and the trailer from the same manufacturer. They built logging trailers and they built low beds. They built 75, 90, and 200-ton low beds for off-highway applications. The P510 trucks came with either steel fenders or fiberglass hood and fenders, which was designated by the P510, the way Pacific used to always do things. A P510S had steel fenders. A P510F had fiberglass fenders. I love Pacific's naming. The name of Pacific tells you exactly what the Pacific was. By the start of the 1980s, Pacific had really moved into be a global brand. Their reputation for quality, tough trucks has meant that their trucks were in high demand in specialty vocational applications around the world. And it was in the 1980s that led to some of their further success, is that because they were still a smaller producer, they were able to customize their thing. Whereas a lot of the other large OEMs, there was, for example, Allied Concrete out of Vancouver, wanted a special tandem steer truck to haul more weight. The large OEMs did not want to interrupt their production line to put in a custom twin steer truck. Pacific had no problem meeting that, being a small volume custom producer. Here's a cool example from Pacific on these concrete trucks. So when Allied bought them, they stated that, they're gonna get 15 years out of the less than 10 years they were previously getting. They thought the quality of the Pacific truck would allow these concrete trucks to work for 15 years, allowing them to stretch their investment. Well, by 2008, all 4 of those trucks were still in operational. That's 30 years. Not only did it last 15 years, it lasts 3 times longer than they expected any of the competitors to. That stands for the quality that Pacific put into these things. 10 years after International Harvester had bought Pacific, International ran into some financial problems and they decided to sell off Pacific to Yi Chong out of Malaysia and Singapore. Basically, that company decided, they looked at what Pacific, they seen the growing market for lumber and timber in Southeast Asia, and they decided that they were gonna buy Pacific out and basically build Pacifics for the logging application over there. They outsourced all the manufacturing, got everything made abroad, and they turned the Vancouver plant into just basically an assembly plant instead of a manufacturing plant. By 1987 though, Pacific had sold its 2,000th truck. However, due to the downturn in the economy, what you were finding is that the off-highway market for logging in BC was starting to go down. People were doing more on highway, so weight was becoming a more factor. Because Pacifics were so well built, they were so tough, they were over-engineered, everything was solid. But what they were finding is that the bigger market demand was pushing people into cheaper trucks and into lighter trucks. They really wanted to maximize that payload. As a result, with the recession, you've seen a decrease in sales. Between the average truck dealership was selling 30 Pacifics per year, they were down to selling 1 or 2 per year. As a result, a lot of dealerships went down, a lot of trucks went down. By 1989, Pacific had sold its last P16. By 1991, they had completely sold trucks altogether. Unfortunately, in October 1991, Pacific Trucks was shut down. They kind of reformulated the company into Pacific Truck Parts. They would go on to just be a truck part supplier for people that had bought a Pacific truck before in the past, which is something that I actually really like, is that when the company decided to go under, stop producing trucks, they still thought about their existing customer base. And I can attest to that because when I bought this truck, Larry from Pacific actually got a hold of me. He called me up and said, "Hey, you got the truck. I want you to know that I got the original build sheet. I got pictures from when it rolled out of the factory. I have everything you need on this truck to help you maintain this truck, help you go this truck. You need fenders, you need hoods, you need anything made. You give us a call, we'll still make it." Because basically, that's from, Larry was from Coast Powertrain. Coast Powertrain bought in 2002 Pacific Truck Parts, and they still continue to remanufacture things like fenders and hoods. They bought all the old jigs, the stamps, they bought the IP rights, and they continue to service and maintain these trucks today. Actually, in 1990, technically Pacific closed down in 1991. They did build their last truck in 1993 though. In the truck parts warehouse, a customer came in 93 and said, "Hey, I want a Pacific. Can you build one?" They said, "No, we don't build Pacifics anymore." He said, "I really want a Pacific." And they said, "If you pay 100% upfront for the truck, we will build you a truck." And they built the last Pacific in their parts warehouse for a customer. So I think that's kind of cool. I think it speaks a lot in volumes to a company that for so long has existed in BC that even when they went down, they didn't leave their customers stranded. They kept building trucks. They kept building parts. They served their customers that had bought. They stood behind their product even when they weren't in business anymore. And I think that is incredible and something that a lot of businesses could take away from in that legacy. In total, Pacific Trucks was manufacturing trucks and trailers for 48 years. In that time, they only built 2,308 trucks, but they keep track of it and they say that over 50% of all the trucks they made are still in operational today, which is actually saying something because this is the 500th truck. We bought this thing, fired it up, ran it, worked it. It's still a working and driving truck. This truck is over 50 years old and still works and drives totally fine. This was an amazing, amazing legacy.